Um, Many people think the job of the historian is to record facts, and that's not really the job of a historian. That's a chronologist. The job of a historian is to make sense of the facts, to develop themes, to make it understandable. The theme I'm going to use tonight, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Have you ever heard the phrase, if you've got two Jews, you've got three interpretations? All right, that's what we're going to see. What we're going to see is dramatic divisions within the Jewish community. And those dramatic divisions have led to the creation of a variety of different congregations and different rituals within those congregations. Let's go all the way back to the colonial period. I remember it very well. Okay. Four of the congregations in the colonial period were in Newport, Rhode Island, New York, or New Amsterdam as it first was called, Charleston, and Savannah. Those were congregations of initial development, which meant the Jews went there, they established congregations, initial development. Every single one of those congregations, with the exception of Charleston, died, was reborn, died again, was reborn again during the colonial era, which gets us back to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was created, then it died. But something significant happened in the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the English occupied many of the port cities. So the Jewish patriots from Charleston and Savannah and Newport and New York went to Philadelphia, and they recreated the Philadelphia congregation. Notice it's a slightly different variation of the pattern of congregational development. The next two congregations that developed were in Richmond, Virginia, and Baltimore, Maryland. So what you're seeing is a majority of the congregations in America as of 1830 or 1840 were in the South, not damn Yankee congregations in the North. Okay, in Richmond and Baltimore, you've got a slightly different situation. Many of those Jews had lived other places in America. So we could say those were congregations of secondary development, not the first people that came, but the people who had come from other communities. By 1860, there were roughly 40 congregations in the southern United States. Okay? What had happened to change to multiply so many? From 1840 on, you had a dramatic influx of Jews from the German states. So what you had now was, instead of the Sephardic congregations from the beginning, you have Ashkenazic congregations being established extensively. Now, I thought I had a key statistic here. I don't. It seems like in the last 4 or 5 or 6 years before the Civil War, like 1856, 1855 to 1860, 8 of those congregations were established. So it's giving you an idea of that influx and the impact of that influx on the congregational development. And it's also suggesting that America was moving outward and the Jewish communities were moving outward with it. Okay, but I'm supposed to be concentrating on Atlanta. So let's go into Atlanta. Oh, wait a second. Let me come back 1 second. There was one other Jewish community in colonial America. Believe it or not, it was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Why Lancaster, Pennsylvania? No, because the congregation was established by Jews, not the Amish. No, it was because it was a fur trading outpost. And a lot of the Jews were involved in the fur trade. So this was not a synagogue. They didn't have a synagogue, but they had a kosher butcher, they had services, they had mochel, they had all of the accoutrements of a synagogue without having formally established the synagogue. Now, this is very important because so many Jewish communities are established in that fashion, which brings me to Atlanta. What was Atlanta's original name? Terminus. It was the terminus of the railroads. After Terminus, it was called Marthasville, all right, for the governor's daughter's name, all right? Then it becomes Atlanta. Almost from the beginning, you had scattered Jews in what was called Atlanta or even before Atlanta. These were typically Jewish traders who would come. They'd stay for a short period of time. They'd go away. Sometimes their sons would come back and stay for a longer period of time. The first important family was led by a man named David Mayer. David Mayer was from Germany, and he was the most important Jew in Atlanta for the entire early period of time. Okay, under David Mayer, they started to hold services through a benevolent society. Benevolent societies were very important at the beginning. These were societies that would give charity, but also would become part of the Jewish community even before a synagogue. You had Jewish women who would teach the youth in terms of Torah, not so much Torah as much as the background in Judaism. So you've got women deeply involved from the beginning in the educational program. And this was very true. It was almost like what I've called in other sources, the feminization of Judaism. In Europe, the men led the education of Jewish children. In America, the men were so busy in business that the women took the lead in Sunday schools from Gratz in Philadelphia all the way south, and through the benevolent societies, also the female or ladies' Hebrew benevolent societies first started by Gratz in Philadelphia, but very quickly brought to the south. Okay, so the next thing they do, and this is always a key, is they have a cemetery. And Mayer makes it a point to get Oakland Cemetery, have a section for the Jews who would die and be buried there. You might not have a synagogue, but the cemetery was important. So they developed a cemetery before they developed the synagogue. All right, now I've described the creation of all those synagogues before 1860. The Civil War holds all of that up. You don't have any congregations established during the time of the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Atlanta Jewish community thrives. You may have heard of the New South that's developed in the 1840s. Well, the Jews were living the New South from the colonial period onward. They believed in business. They believed in infrastructure development. And as Atlanta expanded, the Jewish community dramatically expanded. So what happens is they take the Hebrew Benevolent Society and make the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation. This is in 1867, 2 years after the war between the states. And this is the first congregation in the city of Atlanta. It is traditional Orthodox to begin with. Now, what gradually happens, though, is that congregants become acculturated. They go back and forth between Jewish tradition and not so much tradition and intermarriage and everything else under the sun. So from 1867 to 1895, the temple, as the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation is then called, goes back and forth and back and forth. First, they have rabbis recommended by Isaac Leeser. Leeser was the leader of the traditionalist faction of Judaism up to that stage. Then they have a rabbi recommended by Benjamin Zold. Benjamin Zold was considered like a quasi-conservative rabbi. Conservatism doesn't develop as a movement until the creation of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but his beliefs and practices were more like conservative practices from a later generation. So it goes from Orthodox to conservative, Reform. It joins and leaves the Union of Hebrew American Congregations, the Reformed body, 2 or 3 times. Why? You remember 2 Jews, 3 opinions? You had one faction, then another faction taking influence in the congregation. So when the Reform faction had influence, you had a Reform rabbi. Then a year or 2 later, a conservative faction would come into power, and you'd have that rabbi leaving, and you'd have an Orthodox rabbi taking his place. The length of rabbinical stays during this time was like 2 and 3 years, maybe. Many of them just 1 year. So you had essentially itinerant rabbis, all right, simply because the congregations were going back and forth with so much flux that one rabbi, if he was a traditionalist, wouldn't last for the Reform faction, then the Reform rabbi wouldn't last for the traditionalist faction, all right? Too many Jews, too many opinions. Okay, this changes in 1895. In 1895, the temple employs a rabbi named David Marks. He didn't use the title rabbi. He called himself doctor. He didn't have an earned doctorate. He had an honorary doctorate from University of Georgia. All right, but this was what the epitome of the Reform rabbinate was, to be the doctor, not the rabbi. Okay. David Marks was one of the earliest rabbis ordained from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, the Reform Seminary developed by Isaac Meir Weiss. He takes the congregation straight towards classical Reform Judaism, which meant no yarmulkes, no talitim. You would replace bar mitzvah with confirmation for boys and girls. Very little Hebrew, no Hebrew in the educational system. So it was classical reform, and what classical reform stressed, going back to the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, was Judaism should be a matter of social justice, doing good, being ethical Jews, not tradition, not orthodoxy. So it's the Jewish tradition of ethical culture rather than the Jewish traditions of ceremony and traditions. Okay, and the congregation goes with that, and it remains classical reform under David Marks. He has a long tenure at the temple. He doesn't retire until 1946 when Jacob Rothschild becomes rabbi. And Jake Rothschild was East European in his family background, and he gradually moves the temple a little more traditional, a little more pro-Zionist, a little more, well, David Marks was anti-Zionist, okay? So the temple gradually goes towards more tradition, more Hebrew. It takes a long time for the temple to reestablish bar mitzvah and then bat mitzvah. So, Josh.
Was this one of the Rothschilds? Was he one of the Rothschild family?
No. He didn't have the money. Okay. But he is very well known for the civil rights movement. He and Janice, and we were friends with Janice for over 30 years, were deep, very close friends with Martin Luther King Jr. They actually had them in their home. Okay. And he was outspoken in terms of civil rights from the beginning. During World War II, he had served as a chaplain in the Pacific. And one of his very first sermons was that the blood of black and white soldiers was the same. So he's very well known for that. And ultimately, the temple was bombed in 1958. Okay, but so far we've gone through the temple. But that's just a very small part of the history of the congregations in Atlanta. And really, this is a miniature of what was happening throughout the country. In 1881, the Tsar of Russia was assassinated. And as everything, it was blamed on the Jews, and there's a huge rise in anti-Semitism in Russia. And a lot of the East European countries. And you've got pogroms and everything else under the sun. This leads to the dramatic increase of Jews coming to America from Eastern Europe. And my guess is, if I ask a raise of hands, how many of you are ancestors from Eastern Europe? Yeah, I would assume so. Me too. Okay. In any case, this included an influx of Jews from Eastern Europe who were Orthodox into Atlanta. In 1887, they established Ahavat Achim congregation. The translation is brotherly love. Okay? Now, there had been a small number of wealthy East European Jews who had been allowed to join the temple. As more and more East European Jews come, they're no longer welcomed in the temple. The temple crowd feared anti-Semitism. And these people who had spoken Yiddish and they were lower class, they were afraid of a rise of anti-Semitism. This was not just Atlanta, this was a national movement. Okay? So ultimately, even the affluent members of what would become AA were no longer permitted as members of the temple. Okay. What gradually happens is that members of AA, over 15 years or so, gradually acculturate themselves. They're rising into the middle class, they're becoming, or their children are becoming better educated, they're becoming acculturated. So what happens then is that the newer East European immigrants don't feel comfortable there anymore. So you've got a division between the old East European immigrants who came before around 1887 and the ones that come after 1900, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions, at least. Okay, so in 1904, these create Shereth Israel. You know Shereth Israel, you used to be a member. All right, Shereth Israel, the House of Israel. Okay, so Shereth Israel is more orthodox and more traditional than AA. AA remained orthodox, but yeah. In 1928, AA got a new rabbi, Harry Epstein. I wrote a biography of Harry Epstein and interviewed him all the way back in the 1980s. Harry Epstein was born in Europe. His father was an Orthodox rabbi. His uncle was Rosh Hashiva for one of the yeshivas in Europe that had a branch in Hebron in Palestine that his uncle led. So he came from a strictly Orthodox background. But he espoused what was called modern Orthodoxy, which meant that he would speak to the older generation and have Torah study, but he would also have sermons in English. And he would introduce more English into the sermons. So this was a gradual acculturation. Harry Epstein's main goal was to make sure that the second generation of East European immigrants, the children of the immigrants, remained Jewish. And he realized to do that, you would have to compromise. And that's what he gradually did. After World War II, there was a book by Brandeis sociologist Marshall Sclair on conservative Judaism. It was very, very well known. And Sclair essentially predicted that orthodoxy and reform would decline and conservative Judaism would be the move of the future, because he saw that with the children and the grandchildren of the East European immigrants, who were clearly becoming the majority of the Jewish population. Harry Epstein saw the same thing. In 1952, he moved AA from orthodox to conservative. Ultimately, what he did not realize was the resurgence of orthodoxy. Harry Epstein eventually retired, and his replacement went further towards conservatism than Harry liked. What was the move? His replacement allowed women to read from the Torah or have the prayers before the Torah. To Harry Epstein, that was going too far. You see, each rabbi had its own degree of how much ritual you can have and how much change you could have. 2 Jews, 3 interpretations. Okay, but Epstein did not perceive the resurgence of orthodoxy in the 1960s, 70s, up to the present. Okay? One thing I intended to mention at the beginning. Remember I said there were roughly 40 congregations in the South in 1860? The largest Jewish community in the South in 1860 was New Orleans. New Orleans had roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Jews. Realize that's the largest Jewish community, 5,000 to 6,000. You know how many Jews there are in metropolitan Atlanta today? The last census taken about 15 years ago said 130,000. My guess is we've got 140 or 150,000. And us here in the North Georgia mountains don't count in that. All right? So you're going from 5,000 is the largest Jewish community in the South in 1860 to 140,000 in Atlanta. There were 40 congregations in the South in 1860. Now you've got over 45 in the metropolitan Atlanta alone. That shows dramatic increase. We've had a lot of kids. Okay. But what's amazing with that is if you look at the Atlanta Jewish Times, so many of those congregations are Orthodox or Chabad. Okay? It's amazing. What are there? Like 25 Chabad congregations in the Atlanta area? That's unheard of. Except for one thing. What?
People who go to Chabad are usually not Orthodox other than the rabbi himself.
That may be the case, but it's the nature of the congregations themselves. Okay? Because my guess is you probably want $1 million again, as you did last year for your father, right?
I'm not going to get one.
Oh, really? I'm surprised at the Chabad rabbi.
Oh, he did it. No, he put it together.
Okay. In any case, the next congregation we have in Atlanta is Beth Hamadrash Hagadol Anshe Sephard, the great house of study of the man of Spain. Anshe Sephard. Anshe Sephard, let's see, that was what year? 1911. It's still in existence. It's in the Morningside area of Atlanta, very near where Cherith Israel is. And it exists in an old house. Now notice it's Anshe Sephard. There were Anshe Sephard congregations throughout this country. All right? Now, Sephard, we tend to think of the Sephardim, right? We tend to think of Spain and Portugal. Not in this case. That's what I originally thought, but then I spoke to some of the people involved in it. They followed the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria. His nickname was the Ari, A-I-R. He was a mystic in 17th century Safat in what was then Palestine. He was a father of Hasidism, all right? So Anshe Sephard was a mixture of Orthodox and Hasidic. Now, this goes all the way back, as I said, to 1911. And it's still a very active congregation. They've had a series of rabbis through the years. So what you're seeing, again, is the variety of interpretations and beliefs. Now, a lot of those people came from Romania. I'm not sure why, but it's like Romania had this tradition going back to Isaac Luria. So what you have, again, is a different type of congregation for different beliefs and different reasons for existence. So look what we've got. We've got one Reformed congregation, and we've got 3 Orthodox congregations. That's of 1911. The Orthodox outnumbered the Reformed very, very early in Atlanta 20th century history. Next group. Now we're going back a couple of years to 1906. In 1906, there was a small influx of Jews from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Okay? Now, we tend to think of Sephardim as Spanish and Portuguese, but it really is the Jews in the Caribbean. So in this Ottoman Empire, they were considered Sephardic Jews. So they come over to Atlanta and they come over to Montgomery, Alabama. 2 different Sephardic congregations created. But that's not it. In Atlanta, they formed 2 different congregations. They have like 65 people, but they still have 2 congregations. And they realized that was impossible, so they had one congregation, Orva Shalom. Orva Shalom continues to exist today as a Sephardic congregation. Go ahead. They spoke Ladino. Yes. And this is kind of curious about them. The East European Jews didn't recognize them as Jewish. All right? They spoke Ladino. They didn't speak Yiddish. They had different accents, different type of prayers, different food ways. Okay? So the East Europeans looked at them and said, "You're not Jewish. Okay? This isn't Yiddishkeit. This is whatever." But it's curious. You had 2 people that did recognize them in the broader Jewish community. One was David Marks, because he was familiar with history. And by that familiarity with history, he was familiar with the history of the Jews in the Mediterranean. The other was a man named Alexander. The Alexander family was very important in Atlanta history. It actually goes back to the 1800s, where the Alexanders, Julius Alexander, had a hardware store in Atlanta. But they traced their ancestry to colonial Charleston. And when they wrote their family history, they said they had a Sephardic background. The chances are they didn't. It's just that in that period, the Sephardim were considered higher class than Ashkenazim. So it was not unusual for the Ashkenazim to claim Sephardic ancestry. But in any case, this Alexander recognized them as Jews. Now, it's curious, you had Atlanta Jewish Federation. The Federation of Jewish Social Services is established 1906. It was expanded in 1909, expanded again in 1912. It kept undergoing changes. In the first federation, it was led by the Jews from the temple, all right? David Marx and the next big Jewish layman, Victor Kriegshaber, okay? But they recognized the need to have East European representation. So the board had East Europeans and the Reformed Jews, the German Jews, okay? But they needed liaison with the Sephardic community. So they dealt with two Sephardim who were more acculturated and more affluent, who acted as liaison when people in the Sephardic community needed assistance, which they often did. Now, look at what you're seeing here. We've got Jews from East Europe, we've got Jews from Germany, we've got Jews from Hungary, we've got Jews from the Ottoman Empire in Greece. They're all over the place. And each one has slightly different ways of celebrating their religion and undergoing the ritual. All right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. At least, in this case, a lot more than 3 opinions. Okay. Next one. Beth Israel. Beth Israel lives for a very short period of time. It lives from 1905 to 1920. Most people have never heard of it. You remember, the East Europeans who had come over in the earlier 1800s were gradually acculturating. Some of their leaders said, hey, we don't want this orthodoxy at all from AA. So they created a conservative congregation. The first conservative congregation in Atlanta and probably in Georgia, it was the first conservative congregation in Georgia. They had a series of 3 rabbis. They didn't have a lot of money. They couldn't afford a lot of rabbis. The rabbis were very outspoken in the community. They were very ardent Zionists, okay? But by 1920, the congregation could no longer exist, so the members rejoined AA. Okay, so you're seeing another reason for a congregation. Here, it's again where the people are not as religious or traditional anymore, so they switch to conservative. They can't exist because of finances, so they come back to AA. And again, AA is gradually going towards more acculturation anyway. Okay, any questions or comments or criticisms so far? Okay. The next congregation to be established is Beth Jacob, House of Jacob. House of Jacob, Beth Jacob, is established in 1943. Okay? Now, Beth Jacob gives us a new reason for creating a congregation. AA moved from its original place in South Atlanta upward, but then it did not move further and further north. In the same way, the temple moved from its first location near what was originally the the stadium, all right, before the stadium was built, to where it is now on Peachtree, but then it decided not to move. This is very, very important here, because as Jews moved northward in the city, they didn't want to commute. Beth Jacob is created as an offshoot of AA for those people who had moved further away from the city and no longer wanted to commute to AA. So here's a different reason for creations of congregations as the population moves outward, as kind of like in Gainesville. You've got the creation of a new congregation. Okay. Now, Beth Jacob was very, very orthodox. But its first rabbi, Feldman, wrote a memoir that absolutely shocked me when I read it. Have any of you ever read it? No. It is very, very scathing about the members of the congregation. As far as he was concerned, before he got there, they said they were Orthodox, but they really weren't Orthodox. It was he that redeemed them. And he led them through more and more orthodoxy. And Emanuel Feldman was a leader of the Orthodox movement, not only in Atlanta and Georgia, but nationally, okay? But it really kind of surprised me, the bitterness he's felt because they weren't Orthodox enough for him, even though they had created themselves as an Orthodox congregation. It kind of reminds me of what happened with Harry Epstein, where, I'm happy with this degree of conservative, but if you go one step further, I don't like it, right? So the people who created Beth Jacob were happy with their orthodoxy, but then you've got a rabbi who comes in and says, I'm not happy with this, you got to change, you got to become more traditional. Okay. Individualism. That's 1943. You know when the next congregation was established? Does anyone want to guess the next congregation that was established? What?
After the war.
Scott? 1960s. Why did you say the 1960s? It was a huge population explosion. Us damn Yankees came down here to civilize the Southern Jews. Okay. So what you had was this huge population explosion of the Jews in Atlanta. And they streamed northward. Okay. So the next congregation to be established is Sinai in 1968. Sinai was this offshoot of the temple. The temple, just like AA, decided not to move northward. So as the population moved northward and those people did not want to commute, they created Temple Sinai. So to some extent, just like Beth Jacob, it's not really a new congregation. It's an offshoot of an existing congregation. And Temple Sinai existed with a tremendous blessing and support of the temple. Okay? So it's a new congregation, but in some ways it's not. In some ways it's just an extension of what you had before. The next really new congregation was a congregation Sandy and I joined after graduate school in, the late 1970s. Anyone want to guess? Beth Shalom. Beth Shalom was established in 1975. And Beth Shalom had a very different and interesting and important history. Do you know how it was established or who established it? Anyone? It was established by Women's American Ort in Stone Mountain. It was established by the instigation of women. And the women said, hey, we've got Ort, we're meeting, we enjoy this. Why don't we see if there's a movement for a congregation? And they had a meeting, and they had sufficient number of Jews to establish Beth Shalom. So in its way, Beth Shalom was the first really new congregation going all the way back. That wasn't just an offshoot of another congregation. Now, if you look at Beth Shalom's website, it gives the history, and the history is wrong. It said it started as a conservative congregation. It did not. It did not become a conservative congregation until Zimmerman became rabbi many years after its establishment. Beth Shalom started as liberal traditional. That was the difference. The movement. We were members before the movement. We were members when Rabbi Peterman was the rabbi. and it was considered liberal traditional. That's what they called it. And we hated that rabbi, and that's why we left. Yeah. No, our younger son was getting ready to be bar mitzvahed, and Peter is very independent-minded. For our son to go through bar mitzvah with that rabbi, he would become, I don't know what he would become, not Jewish, okay? But before that rabbi, before the move to Dunwoody, when we were in the old house, it was liberal traditional. It was not affiliated with any of the major movements. Okay, now, since then, as I've told you, the number of congregations has multiplied dramatically. We're now up to around 45 congregations, and that's not counting us up here and the congregation in Forsyth and things like that. So what you're seeing is the dramatic expansion of the Jewish population and the variety of different ways of expressing Judaism through the variety of different synagogues. Questions, comments, complaints? If you don't have any questions or comments, it's going to make me feel badly.
I have a question. So when all the northern Jews invaded Atlanta, did a lot of them bring reform?
They brought all sorts of different things. Because you had Orthodox and conservative Jews in the north also. Okay, and at that stage, what you had is young. Well, at Beth Shalom, it started out with basically young professionals. I think the average age was about 30. Very educated, good employment and everything else, professionals, and that's what you tended to have. But the variety of religions, you can see that in the variety of congregations today. So the Northerners came down with all sorts of different religious beliefs.
Just to share with you, Shalom, I was actually on the rabbi search committee for the rabbis who were picked right around the time they were transitioning to the new building.
Oh, it was your fault, huh?
No, it's not. It's not good for women because he did not want women to count. He did not want women to be part of the service. And I did not think that is the direction that the congregation should be taking because I had just had a little baby girl. So I was not okay with that. And so I did not vote for it. It was other people. He just retired.
Yeah, I know. All right, but did he change?
The congregation made him move his position because the congregation as a whole let him know that was not acceptable. That was after we had moved to South Florida, but I am still very friendly with a couple that have been members the whole time. And over time he changed because he recognized the conservative movement was changing and women were counting. And if you wanted to attract young families, you had to allow their daughters to do the same thing that their sons were doing.
Yeah.
Or you were not going to grow your congregation.
Very good. Josh?
You didn't tell us when Druid Hills and Toco Hills became saturated with ultra-Orthodox Jews. I don't know when that all began.
Well, that ultimately is Beth Jacob. All right, there's an entirely different lecture I could give. Or actually, Marnie Davis would do it better. She's a professor at Georgia State, and she's been tracing the movement of Jews through Atlanta. All right, the Jewish community of Atlanta was originally on the south side. Think of where the stadium is. Now it's part of Georgia State. That was the Jewish section, and also the Fair Street and areas like that, and also near Decatur Street, okay, which becomes significant in terms of black-Jewish relations because East European Jews lived close to the black community. And many of the East European Jews owned liquor stores and saloons in that area. So in 1906, there was a race riot in that area, led by the Men in Religious Forward movement, who were Christians trying to end the blue light district, as they call it, the red light district. And part of the attack was against the Jewish-owned businesses. All right, and then gradually the Jewish community moves up Boulevard into the Druid Hills area. It's moving elsewhere in Atlanta. It gradually, in terms of the reform movement, moves near where the High Museum is, 14th Street area. You had a small smattering of German Jews there. And then gradually, just keeps moving northward. But it's that movement along Boulevard and then into Druid Hills. There was a Jewish community near Virginia Highlands at one stage. I think there was a Jewish deli there at one stage. And then with Beth Jacob, and then the influx of more and more Orthodox Jews, and also Jews from, I'm thinking, Iran and some of the other places, they move into that Orthodox section. Yeah, Orthodox. Yeah, it's still a small minority, but they're the fastest growing, partly because they don't believe in birth control. I didn't say that. Go ahead.
Is there a Jewish community in Savannah?
Yes. It was the third synagogue to be created in the United States. It's still very active. They still have an old synagogue there. I think this synagogue goes back to like the 1880s or 1870s. It has a museum there. It's very good to visit there. The problem with Charleston and Savannah was that by the 1830s and 1840s, the economies in Savannah and Charleston declined. And as the economies declined, the Jewish communities did not expand, and they gradually moved away, many of them. But both congregations continued to exist. But this would get me into a different conversation about the creation of reform in Charleston, which is very, very important. But essentially, Savannah kind of stays about the same size. It doesn't really grow very much at all. Go ahead. All right. In the 17 and 1800s, you had a movement called Hasidism, okay? And it was a European movement. And it was more emotional than traditional Orthodoxy. It believed in strict adherence to ritual. The women's role was changed, etc. Hasidic. All right. Now, what happened with those movements is that it tended to be associated with one key leader, okay? And that key leader tended to go from generation to generation to generation in the family, okay? In terms of Chabad, the key leader in America was Menachem Mendelssohn, okay? He was, excuse me. Okay, I'm trying to respond, please. All right. Mendelssohn was a key leader in New York, okay? He had this image of dramatically expanding Chabad throughout the country and throughout the world, Okay. He eventually passes away in his 90s. And there was even rumors, members of Chabad thought he was the Messiah and everything else. He hasn't come back to change the world yet, as far as I know. But in any case, Chabad now exists not only throughout the country, but in Australia, South Africa, all over the world. Okay? Because his image was marketing. So you have all of these young Hasidic Jews becoming rabbis and going from father to son, because that's what typically happens. It goes from father to son, from father-in-law to son-in-law, and they just branch out. And that's what you see in Atlanta. So many of the Chabad rabbis are related to each other. The Chabad rabbi in Gainesville, his father-in-law is in Atlanta. Okay. So essentially, Chabad is one of the forms of Hasidism associated, at least up until this generation, with the Mendelssohn family. Now, Mendelssohn did not have a son to succeed him. So right now, I'm not sure of the leadership of the movement. Seems to be, but he created this dramatic organization. And the organization is really what's doing it. Anyone else? Any questions, comments, complaints? Thank you very, very much for your patience.